It's actually my honor to introduce someone we've worked very, very closely with, a genuine hero of the harbor. If you go into the conference room at the EDC, you'll see a life preserver there. It's on the 6th floor, so it's not ready yet for the next storm surge, but the way things are going, I worry about that. Seth Pinsky and his colleagues seriously have been working I know day and night over the last couple of months since they got the charge from Mayor Bloomberg to try and figure a plan that will help fortify and make our city more resilient for going forward. I've seen a little bit of it, and I'm very excited about the product, and we're going to hear from Seth about the progress they're making and when we can expect to see the full product and what we can do as a civic community to move it forward. So ladies and gentlemen, a big warm welcome for the President of the Economic Development Corporation of the City of New York, Seth Pinsky.
Thank you so much, Roland, and thank you to the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance and all of the sponsors. Thank you to Hornblower for hosting this event on this beautiful boat on a beautiful day. I wanted to talk a little bit about the partnership between the city and the administration and organizations like the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance and so many of you here today. It really has allowed us to make extraordinary progress revitalizing our city's 520 miles of incredible coastline. If you just look at the achievements in recent years, I think they are truly stunning. We've increased public access to our waterfront for recreation from neighborhood waterfront parks in the Bronx and Staten Island and all 5 boroughs, world-class waterfront destinations, Governor's Island, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Hudson River Park, and so many others. We've also expanded our waterborne transportation network through the incredibly successful East River Ferry. In our first year, we more than doubled our estimated ridership, and today are providing access to formerly isolated neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens to over 1 million riders every year. And of course, we've also worked to bring development to our waterfront, creating new neighborhoods with waterfront open space from Hunters Point South in Queens to Stapleton in Staten Island to Coney Island in Brooklyn and everywhere in between. And as importantly, and this is I think something that is really important for all of us to remember, we've also managed to invest in our working waterfront, preserving and expanding employment in key neighborhoods of our city like Sunset Park. But despite all of this progress, in October, Sandy reminded us that notwithstanding the extraordinary benefits of this beautiful coastline, the coastline also renders us as a coastal city vulnerable. The impact of Sandy was dramatic, to say the least, and I don't think I need to remind this audience, but just a few statistics illustrate just how dramatic this storm was. At the peak, the storm surge at the Battery here in Manhattan was almost 14 feet. The losses to the economy of our city totaled nearly $19 billion, and most importantly, thousands upon thousands of New Yorkers lost important family heirlooms, in some cases lost their homes, and in a few cases actually lost loved ones. But typical of Mayor Bloomberg, as we started to move out of the relief phase and into recovery, the mayor realized that as dramatic as this event was and as horrible as this event was, and it truly was dramatic and horrible, that it also presented us with an opportunity as New Yorkers. And that opportunity was both for us as a city government to look backwards at our own performance and see where we did well and where there was room for improvement, and also to look forward and figure out how we can make our city more resilient in the years and decades to come. So on December 6th, Mayor Bloomberg called for 2 reports to be issued in a very short time frame. One of those was the after-action report, which will look at the city's own performance during the storm, and that's being led by Deputy Mayors Gibbs and Holloway, with the results expected to be delivered sometime in the next couple of weeks, and the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, which is being asked by the mayor to answer 3 questions. And those 3 questions are, 1, what happened during Hurricane Sandy, not on an anecdotal level, but on an analytical level, and not just what happened, but why it happened. Two, the second question the mayor has asked us to answer is, what is the future likely to hold for New York City given climate change, both in acute situations like storms, but also in a steady state where the sea level just happens to be X feet higher than it is today. And three, and this is of course the most important question, the third question that the mayor has asked us to answer is the so what? What do we as a city do given what happened during Hurricane Sandy and given what the future is likely to hold? Our final report is due in May, and the report is currently in progress. But what I can report to you is that we have made very significant progress. We have a team of over 30 people who are working full-time on pulling this report together, including Dan Zarilli, who you'll hear shortly on this panel. And by the way, we're working very closely with a number of the panelists that you see here today. And the goal of this team is to develop a detailed plan for the city, a detailed plan that includes changes in regulations, changes in legislation, as well as investments. And as importantly, we aren't just going to propose uses of money, but we're also going to propose sources of money to match against those uses. And of course, a critical part of these efforts include our outreach efforts, which we've been undertaking since the very beginning of this initiative. We've held meetings with the offices of over 60 elected officials and staff. We've met with representatives of over 100 community-based organizations, and we've held public fora throughout the city that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of New Yorkers have attended. And of course, because this is an initiative of the Bloomberg administration, underlying everything that we're doing is the work of the best science available, including the work of the New York Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of leading academics from institutions throughout the United States who are focused on this very important question of climate change and what its impacts will be. So I'm looking forward with great excitement to share this report with everyone in a few weeks in May when the report comes out. But in the meantime, I think that panels like the one that you're going to hear today are critically important. The panelists that you see before you represent the diverse array of expert voices whose work is helping the city and the special initiative plan for the challenges that we face. And the work of people like the ones that you're going to hear from today will help us to ensure that we not only rebuild from Sandy, and that's a very important goal, of course, that we rebuild from Sandy, but that we do it in a way that continues to revitalize and enhance our waterfront so that we can emerge from this a stronger and better city than we were before Hurricane Sandy. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Josh Robin and the panel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth, and I'm looking forward to reporting on that report as it comes out. The Bloomberg administration, I think, rightfully deserves a lot of credit for the work that it has done on the waterfront. It's going to be a subsequent administration, however, that deals with much of the rebuilding that has to be done and the prevention that has to be done when it comes to preventing another storm. I want to thank Roland for having me here and for having me moderate this esteemed panel, and it's a pleasure to be here and seeing some familiar faces in the audience as well. He wants me to talk a little bit about myself, which I'll keep very brief because it's really these gentlemen over here who you want to hear. I'm a political reporter for New York One. I sometimes anchor our nightly political program called The Road to City Hall. It's the Road to City Hall when it's a mayoral election year, so it's the Road to City Hall now. Other times it's inside City Hall. I also have a longtime interest in environmental issues and the overlap between the environment and politics and policy. So after Hurricane Sandy, well, during Hurricane Sandy, like all reporters pretty much at New York One, I was out in the field. In particular, I was with the mayor and with the governor as the storm approached and as the storm hit and afterwards. And I subsequently had some opportunity to do some field reporting in Red Hook and along southern Brooklyn. And I'm sure, as all of you know, the devastation there was really amazing. And what's more is the fact that this is going to be, by all accounts, something that we have to deal with going forward, something that we all need to confront. So I'm glad that there's so much interest in this panel today. After doing some research, I traveled to the Netherlands as part of a New York One team, and I was actually joined by the gentleman to my right, Professor Bowman, and we talked with a number of government officials and really crammed in a lot of research in only a few days. And a report, a multimedia report that I put together aired and is still available on New York One. It was called Fighting the Tide. So I would encourage you to give me any kind of feedback if you want to check it out. It's on newyork1.com. There's a little link at the top of the page. Now, you can certainly say that there's not a clear parallel between really many geographical areas, and the Netherlands and New York City is included. But nonetheless, experts really see what has been done by the Dutch should be a model for what is done in the United States. And after I came back and started putting together a report, Secretary Donovan, who is President Obama's point person on rebuilding in the Northeast after Sandy, actually signed a memorandum of understanding between the United States and Holland in order for the U.S. to learn more about what the Dutch have done so well to keep away the tide, so to speak, and also what the Dutch can learn from us, particularly when it comes to our skill at evacuations. So it's a two-way street. But I am certainly, I followed this very closely. I'm very interested in seeing what our officials have planned for us, how we're going to pay for it, whether if there isn't a storm, and you know, God willing, there won't be, whether we still nonetheless keep up the interest and the funding that's required to prevent what everyone says is going to be another storm, as not just perhaps in this generation, but in future generations. We care very much about the city, so we want to keep the pressure on our public officials to keep this at the forefront. So let me introduce the panelists, and while I do that, I believe that there's someone who's going to be passing out cards. I'm here to just ask a couple of questions until I get the questions from you. So please, I believe that there's someone passing out cards there. If not, then I'll just call on people. Start thinking of your questions, ask anything, ask tough questions, and we'll have a good panel. So starting with the gentleman to my right, Professor Malcolm Bowman. He's the professor of physical oceanography at the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. He's also the founding director of the Stony Brook Storm Surge Research Group, and he serves on Governor Cuomo's State Infrastructure 2100 Task Force and the New York Panel on Climate Change. To his right, Andrew Carnes works for AECOM as the Regional Market Sector Manager for Port and Marines. He is also a board member of the Coast, Oceans, Ports, and Rivers Institute at the American Society of Civil Engineers, and he's worked on port and marine projects around the world. Philip Orton is a research scientist at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken. He got his doctorate in physical oceanography from Columbia. He's researching coastal flooding and adaptation options around the tri-state area, particularly the New York waterways. Colonel Paul Owen, you can tell which one's the colonel here, leads the New York district of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He's going to be the person who's really implementing what everyone else wants to do. So we can ask him some tough questions about what one he's going to choose. The district is responsible for the Corps' water research, development, navigation, and regulatory activities in much of the Northeast. He graduated from West Point and has a Master of Science degree in nuclear engineering from MIT. He's also served our country with distinction during a number of assignments, including multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And last but not least, Daniel Zerilli is the Senior Vice President for Asset Management at the city's Economic Development Corporation. Daniel is also leading the city's efforts on developing coastal protection measures here in the city, and he's a professional engineer by training. I hope I got all that right. So as you're preparing your questions, let me start off by saying, actually, forgive me, each of you are supposed to have a little bit of a presentation, about 4 to 5 minutes. So why don't we start, if that's all right, with you, Mr. Zerilli, to explain a little bit about yourself and what projects you're working on and so forth.
Sure. Is this working? Can everyone hear me back there? Hello?
We have to turn it on.
Can you hear me in the back? Better? Great. Thanks for being here today, and thanks to the MWA for having this panel. I think it's a really important topic for everyone to understand and make sense of all the different commissions and reports and studies that are currently happening right now, and how we're ultimately going to make the city safer and more resilient. Post-Sandy, certainly the city has taken on a number of different roles in relief and recovery and rebuilding. And as Seth mentioned, sometime in early December 6th, the mayor really charged us and saw the opportunity to take on a longer-term rebuilding and resiliency effort in order to help direct some of the resources that are going to be coming into the region for resiliency purposes. And really, just to reiterate from Seth what it is that we're actually doing. What the mayor charged us with in early December was really answering those three key questions of what actually happened during Sandy and why. And the why is just as important as the what, because it helps us understand where in our infrastructure network those single points of failure occurred, how they propagate through the system, and starts to point towards areas where we need to focus additional resources. Two was looking at just beyond Sandy. Sandy came and went. Sandy's not coming back. But other storms could be coming our way, and even more broadly, there's other climate change risks that we should be analyzing, whether it's increased precipitation, increased heat, wind, drought. The special initiative work that we're undertaking is looking at the broad range of climate risks, not just hurricanes, that could be facing our city. And with that information now, the real money question is, well, what do you do about that information once you know it? How do you make the city more resilient? And we've really chosen to answer that question in two key ways. One is locally, for those neighborhoods hardest hit from Sandy, what can we do to rebuild those neighborhoods in a way that makes them safer, it makes them more resilient, makes them able to handle the climate risks that we're seeing? And then more broadly, across the entire city, what can we do with our entire infrastructure network? And infrastructure broadly defined of transportation infrastructure, the coastal protection elements of the city, our health and hospitals networks, housing, across a broad range of infrastructure. What is it that we should be doing, and where can we best direct limited resources to help our city face these climate risks to come? As Seth mentioned, we're facing we have a May deliverable date. The mayor committed to delivering a report in May, and that's when you'll see final product from us. But it's helpful for you to understand, and some of you have heard this spiel a few times. For those who haven't, we're really looking at a broad range of opportunities across the city. I'm currently sitting in the coastal protection section of this report and trying to understand how we can direct resources on the coast to maximum benefit for the folks who live in and near the coast, as well as the whole city. And what it is that we're doing is we're looking at a broad range of interventions. And one thing I've learned from this process is that there's a million solutions out there, and everyone wants to tell you what their solution is. What's been more important is making sure we ask the right questions and understand that we're trying to solve the right problems. And having gone through the risk analysis, having gone through the impacts of Sandy, we've identified a number of key risks, including the risk of sea level rise, and we're being advised by the New York City Panel on Climate Change on what those projections currently look like right now. And then certainly the risks of increased storms on the coast, and both the flooding risks, the wave action, the erosion risks that come with those, and trying to target interventions, broad range of interventions that face those particular risks. On the coast itself, the additional climate risks play less of a role, but we're looking at everything that may impact our city. And you brought up the point of the Dutch. We've certainly been looking all across the globe. It's not just what we can come up with here in New York City that makes sense for our city. We're trying to make sure we learn the best lessons and best practices from around the globe and see what may apply here and what may not apply here. Again, getting back to the question of what are the key risks that we face, and what are the key problems we're trying to solve. I think with that, I think I'll leave it for that, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. And as we head towards May, we've been talking to we've been doing a lot of community outreach, a lot of talking with interested organizations, and we're certainly soliciting additional input, and people feel free to reach out to me after this session's over.
Okay. Colonel?
Good morning. My name is Colonel Paul Owen, as stated before. My Army career has taken me a lot of places, and in September of last year, it dropped me here in New York City, and a month later, we experienced this historic hurricane/superstorm Sandy. So, but even though I'm new, I just want to kind of let everybody know that we have a tremendous pool of talented engineers, environmentalists, biologists, in the New York district, and some of them are here today too. Joe Seaboat and Anthony Ciora are two of our team members here that have lived and worked here for many, many years and bring a wealth of experience and information and talent to that makes me confident we're heading on the right path, and we're going to be able to quickly, and that term's relative, but quickly reestablish the protection systems that were, and the risk reduction systems that were part of the shoreline before the storm happened. I'm sure my colleagues here will talk a little bit more about the storm impacts and maybe the significance and the scope of the storm. So I'm going to focus more on what we see as the way ahead. So after the storm happened, we had a number of existing projects that were either completed, they were on some kind of construction timeline, or there was a study that was being developed on them. And for those projects, we have a pretty clear way ahead. For the areas that we did not have any existing core projects, and those areas include places from people that I've talked to today, like Hoboken, Moonachie, even Manhattan had some areas that were damaged where we did not have core projects. For those areas where we had core projects, again, we have a clear way ahead. And a quick way ahead to repair and restore those projects that were damaged. The longer term process of determining the areas that were damaged by and impacted by Sandy that we did not have core projects is going to take a little more time. And that basically breaks down into 3 different phases that we're looking at. Okay, and our first phase is to repair and restore the areas of our completed projects that were damaged by Sandy. So that is to, and underneath the Public Law 113-2, which is the Hurricane Sandy supplemental bill that was passed by Congress and signed by the President recently, that allows us to go back to the original design conditions of the projects that were initially completed. An example of that is in the Rockaways. So in those projects are 100% federally funded, so that's a good deal. And we're going to be able to restore those projects. And that's our primary and foremost goal that right now is to get those areas that are most vulnerable from the storms up to a condition where there's a level of risk reduction that will protect against the storms that they were designed to protect for originally, which again is, that storm is not it's not Hurricane Sandy. That was a much bigger storm than what the storms were designed to protect against. Phase 2 will be to complete our authorized projects and to finish the studies that are authorized. So there's several of those projects out there. And those are kind of broken down into 3 different categories. There's ongoing construction. There's projects that were authorized but were never constructed for a various number of reasons. Some of it could have been some opposition from the local community. Some of it could have been public funding. Could have been public funding. Some of it is federal funding not available to complete, and some things like that. Any myriad of reasons could have allowed us to have a project that was authorized but no money or had been appropriated for it, or again there was some opposition with the local community about it being completed. So the third, well, this is still part of the second phase, but we're going to complete authorized studies. So one of our studies in an area that was significantly damaged is the South Shore Staten Island. So that project is under study right now. We're going to be allowed to complete that study. The federal funding is available, and then we'll also be allowed to have the authorization to complete the construction that follows with that study. So that's the first 2 phases. Again, I'll just real quick to recap. The repair and restore is the initial phase. the complete authorized projects is the second phase. And the first phase will probably happen, it's going to start very soon. And we're in the process of advertising for contractors to come and do the construction, and we expect to start in late May and early June with specific project actions that are going to allow us to quickly get that restoration going. The completed but authorized projects are going to start probably later this year and then more so into next summer. The final phase is this comprehensive study, which I think is this group's probably biggest concern, and how we're going to implement any of the future changes that need to be incorporated into design for future storms, the intensity and the frequency of storms. So the comprehensive study will look at long-term effects, areas for future analysis. We'll do some detailed coastal GIS mapping, future storm modeling to understand what that potential impact could be, and it's going to look at a range of measures in order to figure out what should be considered in terms of what future projects look like. Okay, and that's all I want to do to just sum up those three different phases, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Professor, if you just put it right at the camera. Okay.
I'm Philip Orton, and I'm a research scientist at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, right there, the tall building on Hoboken Island, as it once was. I am a researcher into storm surges, so I've been doing a lot of research that suddenly has become very important for the city and the region. And I'm lucky enough in my 2.5 years I've been working at Stevens that I get to work with their forecast model from the New York Harbor Observing and Prediction System, which you can visit online at stevens.edu maritime forecast. And a lot of people use it for various reasons around the area. I get to play with that model and sort of control, look at Sandy and other events, storm surges, and I get to put things in the way of the storm surge. I get to put in barriers, wetlands. I sort of get to play around and play God with the New York Harbor region. And so I'm the lucky person who has that opportunity. So I've been doing research into things like storm surge barriers and wetlands for about a year now, and studying things with the storm surge barrier, for example, to see how much they would raise a flood outside of a storm surge barrier, for example. So I can speak to those things. And so personally, I'm a skeptic of walls. I see what happened with storm surge barriers and levees in systems like New Orleans, and my concern with walls is that you can protect for certain heights, but if you have a design height, and Malcolm will talk about this a little bit too, my one concern is that you don't make the risk in total worse by making, for the example of New Orleans, by encouraging more development, and also by making the hazard more dangerous, the danger bigger, by creating a deeper bathtub when it does fail. So that's my big concern with barriers, and it's not just New Orleans, some faraway place that maybe wasn't managed well by its government. It's also places like Staten Island. Staten Island had its coastal berm raised in front of the neighborhood Midland Beach, next to Father Capodanno Drive back in the 1950s, and all that did, because they didn't raise it high enough, was it made a deeper bathtub in those neighborhoods when Sandy overtopped it finally, after all these decades. So, and lastly, on that point, in an era, I think deciding on this design height in an era of accelerating sea level rise, which we know is coming, is particularly problematic. So those are my big concerns with seawalls and barriers. One thing that I can speak to a lot is I've been doing research on things like wetlands and coastal restoration. And while most areas of New York City, there's a rule of thumb that says you need about 2.5 miles of wetland to reduce a storm surge by about 1 foot. So that's not very encouraging. But and so it may not be a good way to protect New York, the center of New York Harbor here in Manhattan, and things like oysters. Also, they only have a impact if you have a large area that you can change and restore. So I've been looking at Jamaica Bay. It's one of the few places in the region where there's a real opportunity. You've got more than 10 kilometers that the water has to pass over to get to the neighborhoods of South Brooklyn and Queens and the north side, the back side of Rockaway Beach. And what we see with our model results is that just shallowing without even putting in wetlands or anything, just stopping dredging of Jamaica Bay over decades. Right now they take about 1 meter of sediment out of the entrance channel to Jamaica Bay per decade. So just saving money by no longer dredging it, decommissioning that entrance channel, which isn't used very much, It's used for the sewage treatment barges and things. Maybe over decades we could shallow that channel, and that reduces storm surge from Sandy based on our model runs, our forecast model runs. We can look at Sandy and we see that it reduces the flooding by 2 or 3 feet from Sandy. So it's not necessarily complete protection, but also it doesn't make, like walls can make, it doesn't create more of a, it doesn't reflect the storm surge, and it also doesn't create a bathtub if it gets, it sort of absorbs the surge instead of reflecting it. And then we can also look at, thinking more about the history of New York. One thing we've been looking at a lot is the history of New York City storm surges and flooding. And in 1821, if we put Sandy into perspective, 1821 we had a similar storm, but it was a much faster storm, a Category 3 storm, more like the 1938 hurricane that hammered Long Island. And for that kind of storm, shallowing of Jamaica Bay can reduce the storm surge to where there's no flooding, because the friction, the increased friction from having the water have to go through a narrower channel, a smaller space, the wind turns around before the floodwaters can even get into the system. So you can reduce that kind of flood dramatically and stop flooding entirely. And we feel like those types of storms are more common than the Sandy type storm. We've had a Category 1 in 1893, a 3 in 1821, 1938 hurricane. Sandy was a very unusual storm. But nevertheless, you can still reduce the flooding from Sandy by 2 or 3 feet. And the importance of Jamaica Bay is it's not just some place over there that's not important to New York City and the harbor. There's about 300,000 people. It's the place with the most population in the harbor that are threatened by, that live within 5 meters of mean sea level. So the most vulnerability of our population is around those neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay. So we can think about Jamaica Bay, and if you think about it in this way, it's a storm protection strategy to transform Jamaica Bay in these ways. And so you can start thinking about billions of dollars for maybe moving wastewater infrastructure to where it pipes sewage effluent offshore, and to where you restore the system in a much bigger way, not just to improve the environment, but also to protect the population. So this gives us license to imagine a future where there's no sewage overflows into Jamaica Bay, there's no sewage effluent, there's large areas of wetlands, mud flats, shallower water, but still opportunities for recreational boating, maybe no longer shipping, however, where there's fish, and it's very good nursery for fisheries, for the region's fisheries. And lastly, there's much lower flood risk. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Phil. I just wanted to touch briefly on, when Roland asked me to talk on this panel, I kind of represent the kind of consulting engineer in the room here. And what's the engineer's role in recovering from Sandy? And I think a lot of people think that all the engineers want to do is build big walls and big, great projects, but maybe I'll try to dismiss that a little bit. I think there's a number of ways to look at recovery from storm surge or these types of events. So there's resisting, so preventing this from ever happening by building those big walls or permanent sea walls. I mean, that's one approach. Then there's reinforcing, so dune reconstruction, wetland restoration, beach nourishment, some softer things. Also looking at things like plugging the tunnels and some water stops or flood walls and stop blocks to prevent the water from getting into critical infrastructure. Or you can restrict things, so you can change the codes, make it more difficult in building forward so that we don't make mistakes moving forward. Or then you can retreat, and that's really a political decision and the will of the people there. So really resisting, reinforcing, restricting, or retreating. So those are some of the paths forward you could take. And then as far as what the engineering community is doing, I'm with the American Society of Civil Engineers, our COPRI Institute, but the Metropolitan section of ASE is having their technical seminar yesterday and today, and Malcolm was there as a speaker. And it's really, it was an interesting speeches yesterday. All the agencies, MTA, Port Authority, DOT, and what's transit, and DEP, all talking about what their preparation was, what the effect of the storm was, and then how they're moving forward. So similar to helping Dan and his group out, the engineering community is having a voice in this and looking how we can move forward in a smarter way, because just rebuilding in kind may not be the answer. We have to look at moving forward in a resilient and sustainable way forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Malcolm.
Thank you very much. And is the mic working? Yeah. As we've just heard, this is not just a New York City problem. This is a New Jersey problem. This is a Long Island problem. I'm looking out the window here, and I'm looking at the Hoboken Transportation Terminal, the most vulnerable terminal in New York City, and one of the first things to flood during Sandy. I hear a clamor of voices all around me about what to do next. I see a clash of cultures. I see the engineers versus the environmentalists versus the policy people, and there's a lot of talking past each other. It's almost like a Tower of Babel right now, and all with good intention. And I believe that this confusion will continue until the political leadership of this country, of this state, and of the city agree that this Sandy-induced catastrophe must never be allowed to happen again. It must never be allowed to happen again. And if our political leaders will make that statement, then I think that will clarify a lot of what the solution should be, how much they might cost, what's affordable, what's not, what's local, what's regional. And I think anything less than a statement like I've just said is really a betrayal by leaders with knowledge, power, and influence against the people of this city. And it's also a betrayal to future generations. If we do not face this huge challenge ahead of us to strengthen the city, to do what we have to do to make sure this tragedy never happens again. So what to do? As we've just heard, to rebuild, retreat, strengthen the protection systems, all of those things. At the American Society of Civil Engineering meeting that's going on right now, I heard yesterday anguish by experts in the Department of Transportation, the MTA, the DEP, Con Ed. What's that anguish about? The anguish is about, well, yes, we can repair the damage, but what is in the future? Can we expect? How high do we have to build that moat around that critical Con Ed substations on the East River? What do we do? So at the moment there seems to me an agency by agency kind of plan about how to protect the metropolitan region. And so what I'm really saying is that we need a regional plan, that the individual agencies cannot afford the kind of protection that they deserve and the city needs. And so we have to look at this from a collective point of view with people from New Jersey, Long Island, and New York City. And I'll just finish off by saying that Bill Keller, former executive editor of the New York Times, wrote an op-ed piece in the Times following Sandy saying we need a new Manhattan Project. We need a new Manhattan Project to put everybody to work, to build a city and a system to ensure that this never happens again. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all very much. You guys asked some great questions. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to do my best. So I need the panelists to try to keep their remarks very tight and to the point. There are a lot of questions about the storm surge barrier, which I think we'll get to, but other questions are about just what Professor Bowman was saying about the process. So let me try to summarize a number of them and ask the Colonel. There are a lot of different governmental groups and pots of money, and it takes a lot of time. So to boil it all down, perhaps summarizing these questions, thinking out of the box, thinking, long term, what would make your job easier to get done what needs to get done, whether it's done man-made, whether it's more natural barriers, whether it's retreating and so forth. I mean, your agency is the one who's responsible largely for the waterfront and for doing the prevention. So how can we get it done faster and cheaper?
So faster and cheaper, yes, that's always a challenge, and we're at a historic point right now. We're just on the cusp of this storm happening, and so there's a huge amount of public interest, as represented by this incredible investment that the American people have given to New York City in the form of the Hurricane Sandy supplemental bill, and $60 billion of that is available and ready for us to use towards repairing the damage and looking at future storms for Hurricane Sandy. So the whole bill, I think if you whittle it down, we get about $1.7 billion here in New York to repair the projects that's just for New York, to repair the projects that were damaged and look at future studies. So, I think the thing that we have right now is we have this incredible public interest, and we've got to sustain that through, this summer season when some other concerns that have caused projects to fail in the past may come to fruition. Recreation benefits associated with flood risk reduction projects and things like that can tend to make things look more important at certain times when they're not faced with an immediate crisis that we're just on the cusp of with Sandy. So I think sustained public interest is something that would be very helpful, and the acknowledgement that we're still vulnerable and realizing that until we get some of these protection systems back up.
Does anyone else sort of chime in who can look at the government bureaucracy? Because I think what Professor Bowman was saying is all of our leaders are pretty much saying that we can't let this happen again. But the problem is that they have different pots of money, they have different agendas, there's different politics behind it. Is there anything that you gentlemen would suggest we do to, one person had suggested something akin to what goes on in the Great Lakes, where there's one regional authority that's responsible to it. Are there too many different alphabet soup agencies who are in charge of our waterfront? Does anyone want to tackle it?
From our point of view, and from Mayor Bloomberg's task force, it's important that the city, first off, be speaking as one, but separately be working as closely as we can with our partners and with all the other agencies that are looking at this issue. It's certainly our intent to work as closely as we can with the Army Corps. We acknowledge the opportunities that the Sandy appropriation brings into the city, and we want to make sure that we continue that momentum and leverage those resources. And where the city can help provide that leadership, that's certainly our intent, is to be able to step in with a clear plan of what we would like to see in terms of coastal protection and other resiliency measures in the city, and how we can afford it. And working together as as many agencies, I think we can get there as one. But it's going to take that that public interest and keeping that momentum up of making sure that this stays a priority.
Anyone else on this? Welcome.
Well, I was pleased to hear, Josh, that President Obama has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Dutch government. It was very interesting traveling to the Netherlands. Most of their coastline is protected by strengthened sand dunes. And it's an ongoing, expensive, and everlasting challenge to do that, but they have made their city safe. It's not all storm surge barriers. The storm surge barriers protect the major rivers and ports, like Rotterdam, for example. But it was really interesting to walk on these sand dunes, and Josh interviewed a scientist at the university there talking about how they have adapted, but that's a way of life, and it's some people have their views blocked, other big hotels don't, but we can learn a lot from the Europeans. I like to challenge Mayor Bloomberg to take his team of experts and go to St. Petersburg, Russia, because they've just protected, it's very similar in many ways to New York City, built on the river delta of the river Neva. It's called the Venice of the North. It's chronically flooded, and they built a system that has protected their city 100%. I'd like the mayor to go there and see it for himself, and I think he would realize that there are boundless opportunities, and go to the Netherlands, go to England, and even Italy.
That's a trip I'd like to cover. Phil, let me ask you about this, because half of our questions are about this storm surge barrier. And what I learned in the Netherlands is that it's not a panacea. You have to do the barrier, and then you do other things, the areas that are not affected, not covered by the barrier, and the areas, frankly, that become worse because it rises the sea level on the other side of it. So let me ask you if you can make the case a little bit more, as in addition to what you said during your opening remarks, about why the storm surge barrier wouldn't be a great idea for New York, as Professor Bowman, who maybe you can rebut after that, because you and others have called for it to be built, for instance, from Sandy Hook, New Jersey, all the way up to the Rockaways.
Well, the first thing I would say more broadly on this topic is New York City is not the Netherlands, and we don't have nearly as much as you would think based on all these conversations. We don't have as much in common with the Netherlands as people would make you think. I mean, 28% of the Netherlands is below mean sea level, and 0% of our area is below mean sea level. Actually, right now, 0% of our area is below high tide. There's some small areas in, some small neighborhoods with patches below normal high water. We have a lot of high territory for evacuation. So if we're going to build walls and barriers, we need to keep in mind that's not to save lives. We have high ground. We have plenty of evacuation areas. We need to learn how to evacuate better, make it more appealing, because people did not evacuate during Sandy. And decades from now, people have forgotten Sandy and they won't evacuate. But we have lots of high ground. It's not, in the Netherlands, it can be tens of miles to evacuate, to go somewhere, or hundreds of miles to get somewhere where there's high ground. So that's the first thing I'd say is, and more on my concern about barriers is, is that you can create a fragile system instead of a protected system. You can have protection, but fragility. And so the issue with fragility is that you might be protected for the 50-year storm or the 100-year storm, but with accelerating sea level rise, you need to design barriers that somehow can be raised more and more, or else you're going to get beat by some storm someday and you're going to have a deeper flood behind the barriers and a more abrupt and devastating flood, whereas you should have just been evacuating. So the protections of walls, in a way, are just to protect property as far as I'm concerned, and it's not a human protection issue. Now, I am open to the storm surge barrier idea, but I need to hear more about how they can be adapted in the future, how you can build barriers that can be raised with accelerating sea level rise.
Can I just ask one follow-up? Just one follow-up to that, I think actually works. Ideally, let's say the next 15 years or so, what is your ideal method? What should we see around here that it's going to possibly prevent or at least helpfully mitigate a storm that might come?
Yeah, on a short time scale, I think what I see is a lot of small changes. I think it's very, and even if I think we should study storm surge barriers in a lot more detail. We'll hear more about this later, how to design a good study in this afternoon session. But study it, but also not just the engineering side of it and the physical side of it, but also the human side of it and the vulnerability side of it more, and understand why these things have failed in the past, say with New Orleans, or like I said, Staten Island, some neighborhoods. We need to understand it from more of a holistic perspective and the human side of it. So that's a main point I would like to make too.
And what would you build? I mean, would we see all of these raised up? Would we see more? See more sand dunes and so forth?
So in the shorter term, of years instead of many decades, I think we need to adapt. We need to make small-scale protections. I mean, so it's a really difficult question. Like with Hoboken, where I work, what is the solution? I think definitely people in Hoboken, including myself, are getting our minds open to having deployable storm surge barriers that can be raised up or put in place when a storm surge is coming, because there's not any easy solution. There's not a wetland solution for Hoboken or much of the harbor here. But making adaptations on the building scale is sort of the way I see what can be done in over time scales of years, and protecting individual buildings, air vents for electrical, things like that on a smaller scale.
Daniel, are you going to be calling for a storm surge barrier in your report?
It's the big question, isn't it?
I figure I should try at least.
Yeah, we're really looking at a wide range of alternatives around the city. I think there's almost there's this false dichotomy that gets set up between hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Everything certainly serves its purpose when it's applied in the right location, and whether or not we're looking at wetlands and dunes or whether there's bulkheads and seawalls, there's a right location for every type of intervention, and so the trick is figuring out what benefit you actually get from any different intervention type, and applying that judiciously around the city, knowing that there are limited resources, and trying to find the best benefit for those interventions.
Malcolm, do you want to say anything about storm surge barriers? Oh, and let me just ask you this. One other person had asked the fact that deepening channels and deepening waterways might make the situation worse, and that's something that we saw done in the Netherlands, where they constantly scooped up sand from the middle of the ocean and put it on the beaches to raise their beaches.
That can certainly happen, but if you think of the Port of New York and New Jersey, I mean, it's essential to keep with Panamax vessels. The harbor is going to get deeper, not shallower, if New York City is going to maintain its competitive edge as one of the top 3 commercial ports in the country. New York is not the Netherlands. I agree with Philip, but 75 years from now, we're going to be looking a whole lot like they are now. Mayor Bloomberg has predicted that in the next 30 years, there will be 1 million more people living in New York City. And where are they going to live? They're going to be probably people of lower socioeconomic status. They will find places to live in places that are very prone to flooding. Already upwards of 2 million people live less than 6 feet above sea level in the outer boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens, including 2 of my daughters. Philip said, well, you can evacuate those areas quickly, but I don't think you can. You think of Sandy. The order was given 6 or 8 hours or 12 hours before Sandy hit to get those subway trains out of there, to get the buses and trains parked in safe areas. That's a huge marshalling problem. And if you were pushing Granny in a wheelchair from Coney Island with a baby strapped to your back and told to walk across Brooklyn, how long would that take you? It would take you about 5 days, right? So we are very vulnerable. And so we can learn from the Japanese. Nobody's suggesting we start pouring concrete next week, but we have to study barriers as one of the options that Dan said. If you look at the European experience, if you look at Stamford, Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island, and New Bedford, Massachusetts, all 3 cities have barriers. It took 30 years between the idea and the opening. So that's all those of us who think regional solutions are a good idea are asking for at this point, to study the problem. And I think the governor of the state has called for that, and I hope that the Corps of Engineers will take up that challenge.
You want to say something, Philip?
No, I agree with almost everything he said. That we should definitely study it, and that we, yeah.
Can you guys hear me in the back? I don't know if this microphone is working entirely. I'll put it really close to my mouth. Is it really possible to keep a catastrophic storm from happening again? Seth Pinsky has said, we can't climate-proof our city. It would be folly to think we can. Who wants to handle that one? How about you, Andrew? You haven't talked in a while.
All right. Well, on the engineering side, I think you can engineer anything. If we can build a wall high enough, if we know the design height, but is it going to be realistic economically? Is it going to be something we can live with? So I think any infrastructure that is implemented or built really needs to also take into account how we live in this city. So a seawall that's constructed, if it just blocks access to beaches, isn't successful. So when you build these things, you have to also take into account how we can maintain public access and those activities that go on. So as far as climate proofing, you're not going to design for a barn to be able to withstand a tornado. Same thing with some of the earthquake design work. You have to have certain limits, and I think these studies are what will help figure out what those design guidelines are, and then what the economic costs are for building those things, and then balancing that and making those decisions with an informed decision. So I think this idea of studying is important. You're not going to be able to climate-proof everything. We can't stop the sea level from rising. I'm not sure we know exactly what that sea level rise level is going to be. I think the city has some experts working on that, and that's good. But will we know exactly what that next storm is going to be? I think if you look at Sandy, if you're a statistician at all, you'd look at all your data points and you'd see Sandy and you'd say, well, that one doesn't make sense. We'll take that out. So how we look at Sandy as far as where that fits into designing for sea level rise plus storm surge and storm tide needs to be taken into account as well.
So, and this goes to another question. Is there any consensus among sea level rises? Estimates have been 1 to 3 inches over the next 100 years. I've actually even seen it a lot higher.
1 to 3 feet.
1 to 3 feet.
1 to 3 feet, forgive me.
Yeah.
1 to 3 feet, yes. Is that, is there a widespread agreement on this?
There are several things here. Sea level is rising in New York right here outside the window at about 1 foot every 100 years. This is not due to local recent climate change. This is due to readjustment since the last ice age. The tide gauge at the Battery has been faithfully measuring tide levels every day for the last 150 years, and you can clearly see that. But that's expected to accelerate with melting of ice on Greenland, and if, God forbid, ice starts melting in Antarctica. So there's great uncertainty about that, whether it's going to be an additional 3 feet or 6 feet by the end of the century, and it's not going to stop then. So there is a lot of, and this is what the panel's been looking at, and Klaus here, sitting right in front of me, he's an expert on this, and you should talk to Klaus afterwards because he has some interesting ideas about all this as well. So it's a lot. It doesn't sound like much, a foot every 100 years, but believe me, it makes a huge difference to how the threat we have. And so as sea level slowly rises, and I said it is rising, these storms will become more frequent, not less.
I'm also serving on the panel on climate change for the city, and so I'm in touch with sort of the consensus that's building with that. And in the last panel on, for climate change for New York City, their report gave a range of maybe 1 to 2.5 feet by 2080, but then they also had a rapid ice melt scenario, which was up to maybe 5 or 6 feet, and that got a lot of people's attention. And I think one thing that's coming out now is they're toning that down, that we don't expect that's less likely. It's more like the 5 or 6 feet's more like a 1% likelihood sort of extreme. So that's good news in one respect. So far, we've already had about 8 inches to a foot of sea level rise that is caused by, well, it's debated, but we think it's caused by humans since 1820 or so, since 1850 or so. And so we've had a fair amount of sea level rise already, about 1.6 feet in total. 1/3 of it is due to land subsidence, as Malcolm mentioned, because it still changes in the plate tectonics or in the plate elevation after the last ice age. Whereas Canada's actually rising up, where the ice was pushing down really hard. Canada's rising up about 1 centimeter per year. We're sinking about 1 millimeter per year. So the last point I'd make with this is we're not in a rapid acceleration yet with sea level rise. We still have a fairly slow rate. If you look at a plot for 150 years of New York Harbor sea level, it's almost a straight line. It's very hard to detect the acceleration. So that's the good news also, is that we're not in a situation where we need to panic about sea level rise yet, and there's a lot of uncertainty. We need to be ready for maybe 2 or 3 feet this century, though.
That sounds like a lot. Is that?
Well, and we've all, Manhattan's already dealt with, I'm very concerned about climate change, but Manhattan's already seen 1.5 feet of 1.6 feet of sea level rise since the early to mid 1800s, and we've expanded. So Manhattan, in particular, has been adapting and building up and growing outward with the small amount of sea level rise we've had so far. It's just the rapid acceleration of 1 meter per century is a big concern.
And a follow-up on that, I think when we talk about sea level rise, it's not just saying, okay, well, the floodplain is going to go this much higher. I think, and Malcolm, you can probably talk about this forever, about the impact of storm surge and storm tide combined with sea level rise, and I think that's really what the scary thing is okay, the sea level's up, but once a storm tide and storm surge goes on top of that, then these coastal V zones and things, what's going to happen to that? And how is that going to impact how we live in this city and in the coastal areas?
A bunch of questions for the Colonel. Let me get one of them. How did the Army Corps of Engineers revise authorized projects after Sandy, and how do you collaborate with the city on their storm studies?
Okay, so revising, we have authorized projects in certain areas, and the discussion we've had, we are really working in parallel. The first track is to get as much protection as quick as possible in order to prevent damage from storms that could happen, this season, this hurricane season. So we want to do that right away, and so we're doing that. And in order to do that, we're not going to do a whole lot of changes to the existing projects. If we're going to do it quickly, we got to go with the authorized design to do that. So over the next year, you're going to see not a lot of opportunities for change, although we are doing some reformulation studies and some limited reevaluations of projects that will happen probably a little bit later than this summer for areas that are authorized but unconstructed projects. So we do engage very closely with the local population. We try very hard to get their interests and listen to what they have to say and input. All of our projects have to be technologically feasible, environmentally acceptable, and financially justified. So meeting those three criteria is often competitive interests. So we work very hard. Again, we conduct local meetings. Whenever we do a project, we engage the local community and try to let them give them input to make sure that we don't do something that is not going to be against their will. And that's why some of the projects that we have not executed in the past are not currently done. We do sign a partnership agreement with the local community and the local sponsor. Usually that's with either New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection or the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, so or another local group. But we do that. The good news with the future is a lot of these projects are going to be 100% federally funded, which is a extremely unique opportunity that is going to has the potential to save hundreds of millions of dollars for local and state communities. So we will go forward with engaging the local community and trying to make the project and as acceptable as possible for all the other competing concerns.
I think it's fair to say that there's a difference of opinion between the mayor and the governor as to, quote unquote, retreating from the waterfront or buying out. That's been going on in particularly one area of Staten Island, Oakwood Beach. For the panelists, this is a question from the audience. How do you envision the use and sustainability of communities located on marshland with projected climate changes? That's the situation in Oakwood Beach. The governor is offering to buy out that community. The community is very interested for the most part. The mayor has been, it would appear, less receptive to having people leave their homes, instead looking to shore up their homes. Anyone?
Yeah, I think things are being done the right way in that respect. I think we should always be giving people a good deal to take the buyout option, and retreat is not something. I'm an academic scientist, so I don't need to tread lightly here. I think retreat's really a great solution for low-lying coastal areas, but at the same time, it's something we can do over, as I said, we're not in rapid sea level rise period yet, and we've got many decades to do it, and I think that it's something where we might want to invest some of our billions of dollars in a bank that earns interest and that can gradually be used when it becomes popular, when we get hit by a storm again, to allow people to get bought out and give up living in these very dangerous neighborhoods.
Malcolm, why don't you go into this? Because I feel like there's somewhat of a disconnect among what I'm hearing, which is fine, but in one sense, we need to act now, we need to start these studies, we need to, spend this money. In another sense, actually we don't have to worry so much, it's not going to happen for decades and decades. So where do you fall on this?
Well, it was interesting the day after Sandy hit to hear on public radio the governor and the mayor standing up. Governor Cuomo was saying, look, we're in a different climate era. We've had 2 100-year storms a year apart. Let's stop squabbling about whether climate change is real. Let's all agree that it is happening, and let's agree with some bold new plans. Now, that was a political statement, not a scientific statement. However, it had a galvanizing effect, whereas the mayor was saying, oh, no, we can't, these big new ideas that we're talking about putting out there in the ocean, they're too expensive, they're too big, I'm not sure they're going to work. And so we have this dichotomy between our two top leaders, and until we get some kind of consensus, there is going to be continuing confusion about what to do. The governor's buyout program is an interesting one. It's very emotional. I spent a lot of time at Breezy Point looking at the devastation there. People don't want to leave their homes that they've raised their families in and maybe inherited from their parents, but you cannot have it both ways. If you go to the Netherlands, like Josh and Juan and I did, we see these beautiful little Dutch villages securely protected behind the sand dunes, but they've made a choice. They've traded the view for security, and until people come to that realization, you cannot have it both ways, then we're stuck.
So you suggest that that there needs to be more action on our part, that we need to, that we should be doing these things, because the amount of changes that we're talking about here, I mean, it's a $60 billion bill. Only 1.6 or so, Colonel, is being spent on actually these big projects. When it comes to evacuating Oakwood Beach, you're talking about 80 houses there in a city of 8+ million. So how you have an audience here of very engaged citizens who care deeply about it. How should we be moving forward? Is this something that we need to constantly press our officials on, or actually is this kind of slow, incremental approach not a tremendous amount of Manhattan project? Is that a successful attitude? Colonel, do you want to address that?
The non-structural option, which is what we call it in our projects, is there, and it's a part of all of our projects. So again, using these three things, sometimes the most financially justified solution is to buy out the homes and have people move out, because it's not worth and that is the option that is included in some of our projects. So from that specific, and sometimes that doesn't get implemented because that's not agreeable to the local population. But from an engineering perspective, the technically feasible part and the financially justified part and the environmental acceptability sometimes lead to a conclusion that the area should be evacuated or just bought out or raised. And so that's another issue we could talk about, which is raising homes. And I think it's pretty clear and we're going to do a more detailed report on this, the impacts of the storm from areas that were built up, that were built to FEMA housing standards and were elevated. And the old bungalow homes were the ones that we saw that got wiped out and damaged pretty significantly. But a lot of homes that were built structurally sound and to FEMA standards and elevated survived the storm. So there are ways to do this without retreating from the shore. But either one of them is a significant investment.
Here's a question from a familiar face to a number of us, Adrian Benepe, the former Parks Commissioner, now with Trust for Public Land. Is there any evidence of what role, if any, wetlands or other natural waterfront topologies played in storm surge or flooding abatement? Can naturally occurring or constructed wetlands play such a role? We've talked about the storm surge barriers. Are we going to see more marshlands, more oyster beds, and so forth around Manhattan? Malcolm looks really skeptical.
Did you ask if there was evidence that they helped during Sandy? Is that part of the question?
Played in, I guess, just generally, Commissioner,
Yeah.
if these can work well in a, I imagine during Sandy, but I think more to the point is in a future storm, if we replenish these kinds of natural waterfronts, these marshes, if we create more of them, can that be just as effective, let's say, as these big man-made structures?
Usually not. You need to have a large, it definitely strikes me that sometimes I'll hear about, say, the East River redevelopment of the waterfront, and it'll have stamped on it that this is good for, there's wording that, it can make things resilient to flooding, a green waterfront, but you need a large area of wetlands to slow us, to stop or reduce a storm surge. And so in most places in the region, it's not an option. And so it's something that should be, it's great for ecosystems to have a green waterfront. It can, if you have hundreds of meters of wetlands, you can reduce wave action. That can be very useful. But storm surges will creep over small wetlands.
I think there's other important factors with wetlands too, is not necessarily in a storm surge, but in a deluge type rain, and how that the stormwater runoff and wetlands' ability to act like a sponge to hold some of that water so it doesn't just rush out of the estuaries. So there are other beneficial impacts of wetlands that shouldn't be overlooked as well.
Go ahead, Colonel.
I think we have a little bit of an experiment here with Jamaica Bay, because over the past few years, the Corps of Engineers has been reusing beneficial dredge material and restoring habitat there. So we don't have any scientific or hard conclusions on this yet, but I think our initial analysis is that the Jamaica Bay Restoration Project was a factor and helped do some risk reduction in that area.
Colonel, let me, finally, this is the last question for you. Are there any projects in low-income and urban communities that will receive project funding under Phase 2, which is authorized but not enough funding?
So low-income areas, yes, I believe. I mean, even in phase 1, I believe. So the Rockaways, I would say East Rockaway to Rockaway project includes protecting a lot of the areas that were low-income areas that are vulnerable. So I just quickly say yes. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you guys for your questions so much, and thanks so much to the panelists. It's interesting.